Welcome to the information session for potential applicants interested in the fiscal year 2022 competition for the discretionary grant program that will fund a national center on early childhood personnel equity. This competition falls under the Personnel Development Program, or PDP, which is a discretionary grant program administered by OSEP. This session will provide information about the notice inviting applications, or the notice, that was posted in the Federal Register on March 17, 2022. My name is Tracy Dixon. I am serving as the competition manager for this program and happy to have this opportunity to highlight information about this competition. Make note that the assistance listing number is 84.325C. Next slide, please. I would like to go over some caveats before we begin this webinar. First, the intent of this presentation is to provide guidance only. The information contained in this webinar provides a general summary of the information contained in the notice and the application package. Therefore, it is important that all prospective applicants read the entire notice, the entire application package, and any additional relevant information. In addition, applicants are encouraged to listen to a more general webinar entitled Applying for Office of Special Education Programs Discretionary Grants for an orientation to the overall application submission process. That webinar can be found at osepideasthatwork.org, the same location that houses the link to this recording, and you can find that link on the slide. Next slide. Please be aware of application times. The notice was published in the Federal Register on March 17, 2022. The application deadline is May 16, 2022, no later than 11:59 and 59 seconds p.m. Eastern Time or Washington, D.C. time. That is just before midnight. 11:59 p.m. and 59 seconds on May 16, 2022. Note that this is Eastern Time. Applicants should determine the corresponding time in your time zone and must allow time for uploading by the system. I will discuss the implications of a late submission later in this section. Next slide, please. In addition to the notice inviting applications, important information is found in the application package. The application package is or will soon be available on grants.gov. It contains the most comprehensive information on this competition and how to apply. In it, you will find a Dear Applicant letter from Larry Wexler, Director of OSEP's Division of Research to Practice. That letter contains important information about this competition and highlights application requirements. Please read it carefully. The package also includes the notice inviting applications, and it includes important information about the submission procedures using the grants.gov system. As you review the application package, take a close look at the purpose of this funding as described in the absolute priority and the application requirements. Be sure to note carefully the review process and the selection criteria that will be used to judge the quality of the applications. Finally, carefully review the general information provided in the application package, including the required forms and instructions for completing those forms. Again, I encourage you to carefully read the entire application package and the notice, both front to back. Next slide. In this section, I would like to share with you some program information. Specifically, I will go over the purposes of program funding for this priority and the absolute priority, and discuss applicant eligibility and funding levels for the proposed National Center. Next slide. As outlined in IDEA Part D, the purpose of the Personnel Development Program, or PDP, is to help address state-identified needs for personnel in special education, early intervention, related services, and regular education to work with children, including infants, toddlers, and youth with disabilities, and to ensure that those personnel have the necessary skills and knowledge derived from practices that have been determined through scientifically based research and experience to be successful in serving those children. A number of grant programs or priorities are funded under the PDP, including the one we are talking about today. Consistent with the purpose of PDP, this grant program, 325C, will fund a project that addresses the absolute priority specified in the notice inviting applications. That is, the purpose of the 325C grant program is to fund a cooperative agreement to improve outcomes for young children with disabilities by increasing the number of early childhood personnel and faculty from racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and enhancing equity content within early childhood preparation programs to ensure that early childhood personnel have the necessary knowledge, skills, and competencies, dispositions to deliver equitable, evidence-based interventions and services to young children with disabilities and their families. Next slide. Eligible applicants include state educational agencies, local educational agencies, including public charter schools that are considered LEAs under state law, institution of higher education, and other public agencies, private nonprofit organizations, freely associated states and outlying areas, Indian tribes, or tribal organizations, and for-profit organizations. Next slide. For this competition, plans are to make one award in an amount not to exceed $2 million for a single budget period of 12 months. The total project period is up to 60 months or 5 years. Next slide. In this section, I would like to share important competition information. Specifically, I will review information including expected project outcomes and activities, topics to address in the application narrative and the selection criteria that will be used to evaluate applications, and application requirements and general requirements for applications submitted under this program. Once again, please note that this webinar provides a general summary of the information contained in the notice and the application package. If you intend to submit an application, please be sure to read carefully the entire notice and the entire application package and review any additional relevant information. Next slide. The proposed center has a total of 5 expected outcomes to be achieved at minimum. Specifically, the intended outcomes of this project include increased capacity of IHEs with early childhood preparation programs to develop, implement, and sustain a program of study centered within an equity framework that is aligned with national professional organization personnel standards, state personnel standards, and evidence-based practices. Number 2, increased capacity of states to revise and implement state personnel standards so that they are aligned to national professional organization personnel standards and define the knowledge, skills, competencies, and dispositions that early childhood personnel need to deliver equitable interventions and services for young children with disabilities and their families. 3, increased capacity of IHEs at the associate, bachelor's, master's, and doctoral levels to attract, prepare, and graduate scholars from racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse backgrounds that will lead to an early childhood workforce that is more diverse. 4, increased capacity of states, LEAs, and early intervention service providers to address personnel shortages by partnering with IHEs to develop an infrastructure and implement programs and incentives that attract, prepare, and graduate scholars from racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse backgrounds at the associate, bachelor's, master's, and doctoral levels, and support them to enter and stay in the early childhood profession. And 5, increased capacity of IHEs to recruit and retain faculty from racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse backgrounds to improve scholar engagement and retention in early childhood preparation programs. Next slide. The notice lays out how the application narrative should be divided into 5 sections. These sections correspond to the selection criteria that are used to evaluate each application, including significance, quality of project services, quality of the project evaluation, adequacy of resources, and quality of project personnel, and last, quality of the management plan. I will go over each of them briefly and point out in general terms what the narrative should address in each section. Please, again, read the notice carefully since the information contained in the notice is much more detailed than what is provided in this webinar. Next slide. First, the applicant must demonstrate in the narrative section of the application under significance how the proposed project will address current and emerging needs to strengthen early childhood pre-service preparation to ensure that the early childhood workforce is prepared to serve young children with disabilities and their families who are from racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse backgrounds. The project will also address current and emerging needs of early childhood preparation programs to attract, prepare, and graduate scholars from racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse backgrounds at the associate, bachelor's, master's, and doctoral levels. Next slide. The applicant must also demonstrate in the narrative section of the application under significance how the proposed project will address current and emerging needs for states to partner with IHEs to address the current shortages of personnel and to ensure that the early childhood workforce is racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse and prepared to serve young children with disabilities and their families also from racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and for IHEs to attract and retain faculty from racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse backgrounds into early childhood preparation programs. As you read the entire notice itself, you will see additional detail added under each of these areas. Next slide. Last, The applicant must describe how it will improve the capacity of the early childhood workforce to deliver equitable interventions and services for young children with disabilities and their families, and the likely magnitude or importance of this improvement. Next slide. Under quality of project services, the narrative should demonstrate how the applicant will ensure equal access and treatment for members of groups that have traditionally been underrepresented based upon race, color, national origin, gender, age, or disability, how the applicant will achieve its goals, objectives, and intended outcomes by providing measurable outcomes and a logic model, how the applicant will use a conceptual framework to develop project plans and activities, and last, how the project will use current research and make use of evidence-based practices. Next slide. Additionally, under quality of project services, the narrative should demonstrate how the applicant will develop products and provide services that are high quality, sufficient intensity, and duration to achieve the intended outcomes of the proposed project, including how the proposed project intends to develop an equity framework, a professional development framework, state personnel standards, and recruitment and retention frameworks. Next slide. And last, under quality of project services, the narrative should demonstrate how the applicant will describe its approach to providing universal, targeted, and intensive technical assistance, and the project must demonstrate how it will develop products and implement services that maximize efficiency, and demonstrate how the project will develop a dissemination plan that describes how the applicant will systematically distribute information, products, and services to promote awareness and use of the center's products and services to varied intended audiences using a variety of dissemination strategies. Next slide, please. Under the quality of project evaluation, the narrative should provide assurances to work with the center to improve project performance, or SIP, in the following ways. Revise the logic model to ensure a more comprehensive measurement of implementation and outcomes, and to reflect any changes or clarifications to the model discussed at the kickoff meeting. The project would also work with SIP to refine and revise the evaluation plan so that it clearly specifies the evaluation questions, measures, and associated instruments or sources for data, that it clearly delineates the data expected to be available by the end of the second project year, and ensures that the evaluation plan can be used to assist the project director and OSEP project officer, along with SIP, to identify the project performance measures. As a note, SIP provides technical assistance on evaluation design and implementation and performance measurement to grantees and the staff of OSEP. You can learn more about SIP in the link provided in the slide. Next slide, please. In the adequacy of resources and quality of project personnel section, the narrative should demonstrate how the proposed project will encourage applications for employment from persons who are members of groups that have traditionally been underrepresented based upon race, color, national origin, gender, age, or disability as appropriate. The project will also demonstrate the proposed key project personnel, consultants, and subcontractors have the qualifications and experience to carry out the proposed activities and achieve the project's intended outcomes. Applicants must specifically demonstrate how the key project personnel have the qualifications and experience in early childhood equity, including but not limited to development and evaluation of racially, ethnically, and linguistically responsive models of early learning, the intersection of race, ethnicity, linguistics, and disabilities in early childhood, equity-centered adult learning principles, and attracting, preparing, and retaining scholars and faculty from racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse backgrounds in early childhood preparation programs. Additionally, the applicant should demonstrate that adequate resources are available to carry out the proposed activities while ensuring that costs are reasonable in relation to the anticipated results and benefits. Next slide, please. In the quality of management plan section, the narrative should demonstrate how the proposed management plan will ensure that the project's intended outcomes will be achieved on time and within budget. To address this requirement, the applicant must describe clearly defined responsibilities for key project personnel, consultants, and subcontractors as applicant, and provide timelines and milestones for accomplishing the project tasks. In addition, the applicant must describe the allocation of key project personnel and any consultants and subcontractors to achieve the project's intended outcomes and how these allocations are appropriate and adequate to achieve outcomes. Next slide, please. Continued from the prior slide, the narrative addressing the quality of management plan also should address how the project will ensure products and services provided are of high quality, relevant, and useful to recipients, and how the project will benefit from a diversity of perspectives, including those of educators, TA providers, researchers, policymakers, and others, including those from racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse backgrounds. Next slide, please. As part of the process of making funding recommendations, external reviewers will judge and score the quality of the application using selection criteria and corresponding points allocated to each section of the narrative. The application package contains information on the sub-criteria within each selection criterion, and applicants are strongly encouraged to read these carefully when preparing the application narrative and use them to organize the sections of the application narrative. Next slide, please. The evaluation of applications also includes review of the application and general requirements specified in the notice. For this competition, 325C, applicants are asked to address the following requirements by including a personnel loading chart and timelines in Appendix A to illustrate the management plan described in the narrative. In the budget section, budget for attendance at several required meetings and conferences, such as a 1.5-day kickoff meeting in DC or virtually within 30 days after receipt of the award, and an annual 2.5-day project conference in DC or virtual as well as other meetings specified in the notice. Also include in the budget an annual set-aside of 5% to support emerging needs that may be identified by OSEP and consistent with the project's purpose and outcomes. Next slide, please. Engage doctoral scholars or postdoctoral fellows in the project to deepen the knowledge, skills, competencies, and dispositions that future leaders in the field need to increase the special education workforce and build capacity to prepare scholars. The project must demonstrate how it will maintain a high-quality website with an easy-to-navigate design that meets or exceeds government or industry recognized standards for accessibility. The applicant should ensure that annual project progress toward meeting project goals is posted on the website, and insurances to assist OSEP with the transfer of pertinent resources and products and to maintain the continuity of services. Next slide, please. In this next section, I will cover some general information related to submitting an application. Once again, please refer to the notice and the application package for more additional information. Next slide, please. Please note that applications must be submitted electronically in grants.gov. Please see the grants.gov submission procedures and tips for applicants included in the application package. We strongly recommend that you do not wait until the last day to submit your application. Grants.gov will put a date time stamp on your application and then process it after it is fully uploaded. The time it takes to upload an application will vary depending upon several factors, including the size of the application, the speed of your internet connection, and the time it takes for grants.gov to process the application, and that will vary. Further, if grants.gov rejects your application, you will need to resubmit successfully to grants.gov before 11:59 p.m. and 59 seconds. Again, that is Eastern time on the deadline date of May 16th. If there are reasons why an applicant cannot submit using grants.gov, the applicant must follow the information contained in the application package precisely. Please note that applications cannot be submitted by email, must be submitted prior to the deadline of 11:59 p.m. and 59 seconds on May 16th, are uploaded and submitted. It is a two-step process, so it will take longer than you think. We strongly encourage applicants to submit all narratives and attachments in a PDF read-only, non-modifiable format. Some important notes about submission. In order to make sure that the application is submitted on time and correctly, please register as early as possible in grants.gov and start the application process. Do not wait until you have the application ready to register. Grants.gov will create a workspace for applicants to submit the pieces of the application over time. If you are already registered in the system for award management, make sure your registration is current. Submit early, a day or more in advance if possible. Should there be any problems with the grants.gov system, submitting early will allow you time to correct the problem and resubmit before the deadline. Verify that the submission is okay. Grants.gov will send applicants notification that the submission was on time and validated. So applicants should make sure that they receive that confirmation and not assume the submission was okay. Next slide, please. Here are some additional tips for applying for this grant program. Pay attention to the maximum funding levels for the grant as contained in the notice. Awards will not be made for amounts higher than the published amounts. Following the recommended organization, page limits, spacing, and font sizes to facilitate the application review process, and applicants should strongly consider following those recommendations. PDF files make it easier for the system to put together different parts of the application into one application that reviewers can more easily read and follow. The grants.gov submission procedures and tips for applicants in the application package can be extremely helpful for submitting the application in grants.gov. And last, ask, and ask. If you have questions, please contact me, the competition manager, to clarify. Next slide, please. Once received, all applications are screened to determine eligibility for competition. Those found eligible for review will be reviewed as described. Those ineligible will not be reviewed. Some common reasons that an applicant may be ruled ineligible are because an application submitted more than once and the application was validated more than once, so duplicate applications are received. In that case, the last application submitted will be considered and previous applications will be considered duplicates and therefore ineligible for review. There are two additional reasons why an application may not be eligible, and things to avoid include: first, all applications received after the published deadline will not be eligible for funding. Second, applications that do not address the priority will also not be eligible for funding. For example, an application proposing to build a school, purchase equipment for a classroom, establish an after-school program, or provide tutoring services for children with disabilities will not be eligible since that is not the purpose of this priority. Once again, the purpose of this priority is to establish and operate a national center for early childhood personnel equity that translates research to practice for building the capacity of early childhood personnel serving young children with disabilities. Next slide, please. As I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar does cover highlights of what's contained in the notice and in the application package. Again, please read the entire notice and the entire application package as well as related information. If you have additional questions, please contact me by email at tracy.dixon@ed.gov. Email is the preferred approach. You may also contact me by phone at 202-245-7844. Please leave a voice message and I will return your call as soon as possible. Thank you for participating in the webinar today. And again, reach out should you have any questions. Thank you.